I see you found our little hiding spot in the universe. Don't get too comfortable. This is a place where you will find those with an experience that's out of this world, or possibly deep within your life. I welcome you to the Oracles with James Tyson. Lean forward and listen. We will pull you into a supernatural journey with guests from around the world, each one experiencing some of the most extraordinary phenomena this wee planet has to offer. Now, here are the Oracles with James Tyson.
Thank you, Liam, you funny little alien you. We're going to be talking about you people and all your spaceships. Thank you, listener, too, for tuning into this episode of the Oracles with James Tyson. It's me, James, and today with me is Kevin Randle. He is the author of the Best of Project Blue book, which examines the evidence for alien visitation that is found in the official Air Force investigation. And Kevin using Project Blue book files as his basis for a new, better investigation. And we're going to talk about how he did it. Not really getting into how you apply for the Freedom of Information Act, but he has a way of digging into the minutia, getting into the details. And if you think about it, back in 1947, the guys were going out and they were just getting information from witnesses. And as their project went on, policies changed, they had different direction, and we're going to talk a lot about that. And we're going to talk about what maybe those guys were thinking at the time and how their management controlled the speed, flow, and direction of an investigation, whether it was a positive or a negative for we who are interested in UFOs. And it's a good book, and you can find that book on Amazon. You just have to Google the Best of Project Blue book or Kevin Randle, and it should pop up quickly. You can also go to his website, kevinrandle.blogspot.com. Again, kevinrandle.blogspot.com. Kevin's research into Project Blue Book really digs into the old information, and he looks at it under a new light and asks questions that weren't asked back at the time. So yeah, he went out and re-interviewed as many people that he could find and that were alive, and also went over their statements and found communication between investigators who were talking quite casually about what they were looking at, thinking that the reports that they were writing were never going to be looked at from outside the military. So it's very, very interesting, the information he has. A lot of it was neglected, overlooked by the United States Air Force, and it's now available to underscore the importance of each of these cases. And Kevin understands the military mindset, and his experience as a former United States Air Force intel officer provides a compelling case for alien visitation based on the information that he gleaned by reviewing all the many documents that are held within Project Blue Book, and then his subsequent investigation that spun off of those. This use of the Air Force own records on the various cases, coupled with the new information that Kevin went out and discovered with his team, it's basically, for those who believe that we've been visited, here is strong support for that. And for those who are skeptical, the Best of Project Blue book will be difficult to refute. And before Kevin takes off, I'm going to talk to him a little bit about his other book, Roswell in the 21st Century. And again, you can find that on Amazon. And for 30 years, he's been investigating the case of UFO crash near Roswell, New Mexico. In fact, I think at one point, he and the late Stanton Friedman were considered the experts on that crash itself. And he's interviewed hundreds of people who claim knowledge of the event, been through boxes of documents, and stood and poked around on the crash site and talked to original witnesses. And we're going to get a little bit about his investigative technique, which I think was incredible, because he tracked down stuff that, my gosh, even a trained policeman or a trained homicide investigator may miss. He was scratching below the surface on things just to prove maybe one line of somebody's statement to see if they were telling the truth or not. So let's get Kevin in here now. Kevin, how are you today?
I'm fine, and you?
I am well here in the Pacific Northwest, in the lower left Canadian coast. How's Iowa today?
Iowa is sunny for a change. We were cold and miserable yesterday with drizzle and all that kind of nonsense, and today we're sunny and bright and warmer.
Perfect. Spring is in the air, even though we're in the middle of an apocalypse. How's the lockdown affecting you?
We're in a state of voluntary lockdown here in Iowa. The governor has closed down the theaters and all of that sort of thing, and but hasn't created any mandatory stay-at-home type things that they've done in other states.
Yeah, ours is basically the same thing. It's if I want, I can get on my motorcycle and I can race around, or not race, putter around, and I can also go to the grocery store and do what I want. If I need to do work on the house, I can go to a place to buy gear, and like you can hit the Home Depots kind of thing and buy construction material. Other than that, if I really wanted something, I can order it, and the Amazons will bring it to me. But that's not what I grabbed you here to talk about.
I got you off on a tangent.
Yeah, that's just squirrel. Poof, I'm gone on one thing or another. Your newest book, The Best of Project Blue Book. It's fascinating to me for a number of reasons. One is I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, where the TV series Project Blue Book is produced and shot, and I have a bunch of my buddies who do acting have been in it, and they're having a great time on that. They were until the apocalypse hit, but it kind of rekindled a lot of people's interest in ufology based on the original Project Blue Book that the U.S. government started up. Could you just update my listener, not update them, but remind them exactly what is Project Blue Book?
That was the official U.S. Air Force investigation into UFOs. It started in 1948. Officially, it started in 1948. There was an unofficial investigation that took place prior to that, and it was known as Project Sign. Publicly, it was known as Project Saucer. Project Sign was a classified name, and that became compromised at some point, and they changed it to Project Grudge. And at that point, they said, well, we've evaluated all the sightings. There's nothing to it, and we've stopped the investigation. All they did was change the name and move on. Did the same thing a couple of years later, said Project Grudge is done. We're not investigating UFOs. It became Project Blue Book, and from that point, it remained Project Blue Book until 1969 when they closed it completely and totally. So it was the investigation of the UFOs. Very, very short periods of time did they do quality investigations. The problem was some of the higher ranking officers in the chain of command didn't think much of the idea of flying saucers or interstellar craft. And the lower ranking officers picked up on that, not wanting to displease their superiors, operated in the same fashion. So we ended up with haphazard investigations. Some of them were very good, but most of them weren't very good. And the purpose of the Best of Project Blue Book was to look at some of the cases that had solutions appended to them that aren't really conclusions that would be drawn from the material itself. And if you go beyond that, you find maybe the swamp gas or the ball lightning explanations suggested for a sighting just didn't make sense. So I was looking at the case files from Project Blue Book, but I was bringing in all kinds of information that had been developed long after Blue Book closed, so we could draw, I think, a more accurate picture of what was going on during those years.
In your case studies of Project Blue Book, was it clear to you at the time that there were a number of managers that had a negative influence of the speed, flow, and the direction of the cases that maybe they weren't too comfortable with?
When we look at the history of Blue Book and kind of understand that, back in 1948, they did an estimate of the situation, which is an intelligence function. When you're presented with a problem, you look at the problem, you outline it, and you make suggestions, and you send it up the chain of command. This estimate of the situation obviously looked at UFOs, at flying saucers, and based on the case studies, I think there were 18 cases that they looked at, it said it led them to the conclusion that UFOs were interplanetary. When it got to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, he decided the Chief of Staff being Hoyt S. Vandenberg, the highest-ranking officer in the United States Air Force, he said, no, your conclusions don't follow the information you provided, the evidence you provided. I don't like this. And in the next couple of weeks, or the next few weeks, everybody who worked on that project, everybody who had been associated with the investigation, pretty well found themselves out of a job. Doing that sort of thing. The remnants were a couple of very low-ranking civilians and low-ranking officers who were remaining at the UFO investigation. Well, everybody around that could look at what happened, and the handwriting was on the wall. If I suggest UFOs are interplanetary, I'm going to find my career inhibited. I'm not going to do that. So the idea became, if you are tasked with investigating a UFO sighting, you'd best find a solution to it that doesn't relate to something that's coming from another world. You must find a terrestrial explanation. And that was the attitude that took place for a period of time until I think it was General Cabell asked somebody what was going on in the UFO project, and they told him, and he was outraged that they were paying lip service to the investigations, and they revitalized the project. Edward Ruppelt was put in charge of it. He attempted to make a solid investigation and that sort of thing, but that only lasted for 18 months, and then the Robertson panel, which was a CIA sponsored investigation of UFOs, looking at the evidence, came to the conclusion there was nothing there. There was nothing of scientific value to be learned, and the best thing to do is debunk the sightings. If you've got a good solution for it, you present it. If there's a mysterious sighting that you've now been able to solve, well, you present that information, you convince the public there's nothing to it, and the whole thing will go away. And those appointed to investigate UFOs from that point on, the officers in charge of the investigation, were pretty much rabidly anti-UFO. And so they didn't put up with any of that nonsense either. So you would have sightings where they would gather a great deal of information, but the conclusions didn't make any sense. And one of the best examples, and it's outlined in the book, is at Level Land, Texas, where you had people at 13 separate locations independently witnessing the craft close to the ground, stalling their car engines, filling the radios with static, causing their headlights to dim. And when the craft left, then they could start their cars, the headlights would brighten up, and the radios would come back. The Air Force said there were only 3 witnesses. Don Kehoe at NICAP, which was the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, which was a civilian organization, said no, there were 9. And they got so involved in arguing that point that what was lost is what the people had been reporting. And it couldn't be explained. The Air Force finally decided it was ball lightning. Now, ball lightning is a very short-lived phenomenon. The object itself is maybe 18 inches, 2 feet in diameter, and you might see it rolling down the road. It might come through the window. I mean, it's basically can come through the window without breaking it kind of thing. It's a very strange phenomenon, and it would just disappear. And so the Air Force decided ball lightning explains the Level Land sightings. The problem in 1957, when the Level Land sightings took place, is scientists didn't even agree that ball lightning existed. So they're using something that was controversial and that had not been proven to exist to explain something else that was controversial and may not have existed. So you have those sorts of things going on. And I was able, of course, to look at like the Level Land sightings from the perspective of today, and I could bring everything that I knew that had transpired since 1957, which is 60-some years ago, to bear on this case. One of the things that happened, a guy named Don Burlinson, he lives in Roswell, New Mexico, by coincidence. Roswell happens to be like 3 hours by car from Level Land, Texas. And for those of you who don't live in Texas, Level Land is just west of Lubbock. So you look on your map, there's Lubbock, and you go a little bit to the west, and there will be Level Land. He interviewed the widow and the daughter of the sheriff. The sheriff had passed away, and they told him that the sheriff had gotten much closer than the Air Force said he had. You look at the Project Blue Book files, it says the sheriff got within like 900 yards and he just saw a blue streak. They were saying, no, the sheriff got closer and saw something completely different, saw something circular, something round. I was able to find a newspaper clipping where the reporter had interviewed the sheriff back in 1957, in the days that followed the sightings. And there's a quote from the sheriff in his own words saying that he'd gotten much closer. So I was able to verify what was told to me by Don Burlinson sometime later, told to him by the sheriff's family. So we could look at the Air Force file and say, yeah, that's not right. And so I could bring all of that into bear as well. So we could realize that the Levelland sightings, had they been investigated properly, had the Project Blue Book file suggested they were interviewed for most of the day by an NC who came from Reese Air Force Base, which is Lubbock, Texas. And he said, well, there's nothing to it. He found some explanations. But there had been another investigation going on by the military, and you can see hints of it in the Project Blue Book files. And one of them is that the sheriff was interviewed by some high-ranking officer. And the officer apparently gave him the talking points, for the lack of a better term, on what had happened. So you have the sheriff kind of giving the Air Force explanation or the Air Force ideas, but talking to his family, he's telling them exactly what he'd seen. And you see hints of that in the Project Blue Book files. And then when you talk to family, you get additional hints about that. And you can bring all of that to bear in today's environment, because I have the Air Force investigation on microfilm. I have it digitally as well. And I can compare with what I've been able to learn today with what was said back then, and come to a virtually different conclusion than the Air Force did. And as I say, if the military and the civilian end of the UFO phenomenon hadn't been butting heads and arguing about the number of witnesses, we might be having a totally different conversation. And because of the way the military is structured through the chain of command, you can quickly figure out what your boss wants, and you don't want to do anything to inhibit your career. There has been any number of military pilots and civilian pilots as well, who have suggested that they didn't want to talk about UFOs because they would find themselves grounded. They wouldn't be pilots anymore. And that goes up the Japanese flight 1628. The JAL flight, the captain there, after he reported the UFO, found himself in a desk job. He was no longer allowed to fly. I think Richard Haynes and some of the advocates in the United States was able to get him his flying job back. But the point simply is, he talked about seeing a flying saucer, and suddenly he's no longer an airline captain. He's now sitting behind a desk. And so everybody can pick up on that. So when your superiors don't want you to talk about something, you don't do it. In the military, they can say, this is a classified, and there are strict penalties. If you talk about this, you find yourself in jail for 20 years and fined $20,000. So that also kind of inhibits your willingness to discuss these sorts of things.
Well, that's exactly what Tiago Chichetti, who is the president of the Brazilian Commission on Ufologists, his father, like you were a former United States Air Force intel officer. His dad was in the Brazilian Air Force and an intel officer. And their military pilots, basically, if you reported a UFO, like we'll call it a flying disc, if you came in and said, yeah, I saw this 2 flying discs, they paced me at this speed and this speed, you were removed, and basically you had to go for a psychiatric assessment, and you were pulled off the line. So you're a late teens, early 20s, all full of piss and vinegar, and you want to fly jets? Well, no, you keep your mouth shut. And that's just the way it goes. And you push this underground. And of course, I like your take on this too, because you do understand that military mindset. You understand how the system works, and it sometimes doesn't work.
Oh, the system works. It inhibits the free flow of information. And sometimes in a military environment, you need to inhibit that free flow of information because it's part of what's going on. And especially in a combat arena, you want to inhibit that information simply to keep it out of the hands of the enemy. But the problem is, if you show too much of an interest in this kind of a topic, you can find yourself in trouble and find your career derailed on that sort of thing. And it's a way to keep it quiet. And I think that is one of the problems that we had with Project Blue Book. And in fact, if you go through the administrative files and you look at what was going on, you see that from about the late 1950s, the mid 1950s, there's all kinds of correspondence from people, both civilians and military, suggesting that they need to close down Blue Book. They need to get rid of it. They need to move it out of ATEC, which is the Air Technical Intelligence Center, to the Public Affairs Office. So it's not part of intelligence and now part of public relations. And they worked very hard to do that sort of thing. The Air Force regulations say specifically, if you're investigating a UFO sighting, and each Air Force base supposedly had an officer who was assigned as the UFO guy. Usually it was a low-ranking guy who also was the VD officer and the voting officer and the electric light bulb officer and all that sort of thing. But if he could not find an explanation, and I use he here because the vast majority of them were men, especially in that time frame. Yeah. If he could not find an explanation, then he was not allowed to talk to the press. Regulations spell this out completely. If you do not have an explanation, if there are press inquiries, you direct them to the Pentagon and the Office of Public Affairs, Public Information. If you've got an explanation and it makes sense, then you can talk about it all you want. So what they're doing is inhibiting the free flow of information, especially about the cases that are somewhat unusual. There was a case, and I discuss it in the book, of a guy in Austin, Texas, who saw a UFO, reported to the Air Force. The lieutenant came out. He took great notes and filled out the Air Force forms, and the witness then said, "What happened to my sighting? What was the conclusion?" It said, "Insufficient data for scientific analysis." Well, you have no explanation, but it's not unidentified either. You've kept it out of that narrow category of unidentified, which excites everybody, and you've placed it into this nonsensical category that doesn't have an explanation, but nobody's really interested in it. And the guy wrote, and he was complaining about that, and he said, "What more information did you have?" The officer came out, took complete notes. We got all the information. We got the times, the directions. What more information do you want? And eventually, the case was labeled as unidentified. But the important point is not his UFO sighting or that it eventually became unidentified, but the way it was handled by the people involved, which was to categorize it in a way that it did not excite the public. It was not one of the unidentifieds. It was something else again. And my survey of Project Blue Book, the files, and there's 12, I think there's just over 12,000 cases have been reported to them.
Yeah.
701 are unidentified. The others have explanations attached to them, but I did a quick survey, and it looks like 4,000 to 5,000 cases are labeled as insufficient data for a scientific analysis, which means there is no explanation for them, but they're not labeled as unidentified. And so I was looking at those cases as well to see what might be hidden there, and looking at cases that were labeled as hoaxes, because the other thing they did, if they could not find an explanation, they just labeled it as a hoax. Well, we know this guy can't be trusted. It's a hoax. And one of the cases is the Rhodes photograph taken in July of 1947 over Phoenix, Arizona, of a craft that is remarkable like the original description given by Kenneth Arnold, who started this whole thing in the United States at the time. And when they were unable to identify the photographs, they tried to smear him and labeled the case as a hoax. No evidence it's a hoax. Nothing in the photographs suggests a hoax. Nothing in his background suggests that he would participate in such a hoax. But they made fun of what he did for a living, saying that, well, he played piano at a bar and his wife was a teacher, and so he was living off her income. And it turns out that he had worked for the Navy for part of World War II. He held a number of patents. He was getting royalties from those patents. Others described him as an absolute genius. And you know, this is all laid out in the book. And there was a guy named, I think it's Minol, who was working at the University of Arizona, if I remember correctly, and he hired Rhodes to create a satellite tracking system or something that he needed to have done, and Rhodes was able to solve the problem and wanted to get him on the staff at the university. And of course, he failed the interview because apparently Rhodes had a pretty abrasive personality and just didn't like to be questioned. And so he annoyed everybody that would have hired him. But the point is, here was this guy who knew him well. The Air Force didn't interview him, didn't talk to him. but instead tried to assassinate his character. And I was able to find this guy and actually communicate with him through email and get a different perspective on exactly what Rhodes was like. So I could bring that sort of thing in, but the point really is you see how the data were manipulated by the government, by the Air Force, by whomever, to create this idea that there's nothing to it. And a really good example of this, nobody remembers the good things that Bill Buckner did as a baseball player. Everybody remembers that he cost his team the World Series because he botched one play at first base. They all remember the bad thing, but they don't remember all the great things he had done. And that's kind of the way we are with UFOs. If I talk about Roswell, I don't know how many times people will say to me in today's environment, well, I was just a weather balloon. It was just this Project Mogul. And the thing is, it wasn't Project Mogul because we know what happened to Mogul, and Mogul doesn't work because the documentation proves it doesn't work. But everybody remembers the Air Force coming out and says, well, it was this highly classified project named Mogul. And what we find out is the experiments being done in New Mexico with these balloons in 1947 was not classified. Pictures of one of the arrays appeared in the paper like 2 days after the announcement about the crash at Roswell to kind of lead people in another direction. The purpose of Mogul was classified, which was to spy on the Soviet Union. But what was going on in New Mexico wasn't classified. The material they were using wasn't classified. It was regular weather balloons. It was regular Ray-1 targets. It was off-the-shelf equipment. There was nothing to be confused with something extraterrestrial. But not everybody, but a lot of people now say, well, Project Mogul explains that. No, it really doesn't. And that's the way we are with the entire UFO field. They'll throw the mud at the wall, and if something sticks, they run with that explanation, regardless of where the facts and the evidence takes you.
Kevin, I was an investigator myself for many years. I kind of look back at these guys who were tasked to go out almost as an admin job to gather a little bit of information, make sure that the Russians haven't dropped something on top of us and are horsing around, or there is an actual threat to national security. And that's all they had to base their investigations on. Now, investigative techniques develop over time based on the experience garnered from the previous similar fact investigation. Like, you investigate a homicide, you know from being trained as a homicide investigator or seeing and being involved in a lot of them, what you should be doing and how it's processed and how documentation is kept and filed. These guys didn't really have a lot of previous experience, well, if any, in doing this, other than they worked as investigators to make sure that, we'll say, national security is okay. And as time goes by, their investigative techniques have to change as per the information that they are running into. Well, that's all great until it works its way up the chain of command to somebody who really not really sure about where this is all going. Okay, we've checked it off. It's not a national security threat, but now what do we do? And what do we do with the information? And like any new section, really there's no policy that exists. You may adopt policy from another branch of the government, but you will end up creating policy based on how other people influence speed flow direction of the investigation itself. I give a lot of leeway to the guys at the front end of this. Literally, I look at them as admin guys going out to ask a few questions to make sure the citizens are safe.
Originally, the investigation was to find out what was going on. And you take a look at what Ed Ruppelt had written in 1956 about what happened in 1947, and you look at what was going on, they didn't know what was happening. They were confused. They were frightened by it. By the time you get into 1948, 1949, they realized that there doesn't seem to be an imminent threat. It's not that the aliens are going to invade immediately. We're not at a threat form. And the attitude changes at that point. And they're now stuck with this investigation that they don't want to have, and that is kind of the attitude you see in the later years. Eventually, what they did was they came up with this idea to get a university to look at the problem and conclude it the way they wanted it concluded, meaning the people in Blue Book and the people in the intelligence community wanted it concluded. And the documentation is in the Blue Book files. The administrative files from Project Blue Book is there for us to take a look at. And there was a letter written by a Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hippler to the University of Colorado, which accepted the grant to study UFOs. And Hippler explained exactly what they wanted. They were supposed to find no threat to national security, say some positive things about the way the Air Force conducted their investigation, and then say there's nothing to be found here and we can close it down. And that's exactly what happened. All laid out prior to the investigations begin at the University of Colorado. All of that was laid out specifically. And that's what happened. So they were able to close it down, publicly close it down. We learned later there was something called Project Moondust, which had a UFO component. The Moondust mission, I think, has stated something to the effect of it's to recover returning space debris of foreign origin, foreign manufacturer, or unknown origin. Well, unknown origin clearly could be UFOs, and we know there's a UFO component because there's UFO sightings that were information sent through the Moondust channels. When I was scanning the Project Blue Book files on microfilm, I saw the name Moondust slipped by on the screen, and I went back and I looked. I found 4 sightings in September of 1960 that are labeled Moondust. So clearly Moondust had a UFO component because they're reporting the stuff to Project Blue Book. They're really crummy sightings, and I think basically they were meteors seen under maybe unusual circumstances, but they were communicated to Project Blue Book. You go to the rest of the files and you see there's additional Moondust stuff. Robert Todd found the link to Moondust in a FOIA request he'd sent to the State Department. They sent him a big dump of documents, and Moondust was mentioned in there, and he began to pursue that specifically. I did the same thing. I followed Moondust as well. What we find is in the early 1990s, Senator Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico had queried the Air Force about Project Moondust, and the Air Force wrote back and said there was never such a project. Bingaman sent them documents that were marked Moondust. Clearly there was something called Moondust. Clearly it existed. Clearly the Air Force had part of the responsibility. And the Air Force wrote back and said, well, we were mistaken in our last communication. There was a Project Moondust, but we never used it. It was never deployed. The documents prove that Moondust was deployed. They did do investigations. The documents are there. What we have are again, sightings that aren't very exciting from a ufological point of view, but what it proves is that Moondust actually went out and gathered materials. So we can see all of that, and it suggests that there's something else going on there.
Well, Project Moondust originally, or maybe it was right to the end, a project to recover Soviet space garbage and see if they could glean any information from the trash itself on the Soviets' technology and capability. Would have been a really good cover for going out and picking up, let's say, a piece of what possibly is a extraterrestrial vehicle, or we'd call a UFO. And
well, clearly that was a point, was to recover Soviet space debris.
Yeah.
But the point is there was a UFO component, and that it was deployed as a UFO component. They went out and tried to retrieve stuff that had fallen back to Earth that clearly wasn't of Soviet manufacture. And they did do some of that. There's some interesting things that suggest they recovered some bizarre materials. But what we get through the Moondust documentations, well, somebody had found a external fuel tank from a jet fighter plane that had been dropped, and thought there was something unusual to that, and so it was recovered through Moondust. But the real point is Moondust went out and recovered it. So there you go.
Well, it's a great cover. It's a unit that picks up space debris. Some witness sees something fall from the sky and lands in his field. There's a government agency that's going to go pick it up. In your research, did you have an opportunity to file a Freedom of Information Act request on Moondust at all?
We never found the headquarters, but we would get the Moondust documentation through the Department of State and other organizations like that, and we could FOIA with that, and they would either say, well, we have no documents that are that reflect what you're looking for, or here's what we have. And so we were able to find documents that way and gather some materials. But once Robert Todd had gotten the original batch of documents and the name Moondusted was compromised, the code name was changed.
Yeah.
And Todd had asked for what the new code name was, and the letter that he got back said the code name is properly classified and unreleasable. You can't have it. So what we learn is that after Blue Book ended, there was still in the government an investigative arm looking into UFO sightings, looking into UFO information, and that once the name was compromised, I think it was in 1986, that it wasn't closed, it wasn't stopped. They just changed the code name, so that we don't have access to it, and we have not found what the new code name is. And now we learn in 2004 there was another UFO project that took place, and that's the ATIP program, obviously, with the Nimitz sighting of the Tic Tac and that sort of thing. So here's another UFO program that was going on. So the government's telling us we don't investigate UFOs. If you had a sighting and you would call the Air Force to complain about the sighting or talk about it, and they would tell you, we don't investigate that stuff anymore. If you're concerned for your safety, call your local police department or your local sheriff's office. But the Air Force overall mission is to stop unknown objects penetrating our airspace. And they're saying, we don't do that. Well, no, that's actually your mission. You have to do that. But they have an excuse for ignoring the UFO sightings, at least in the public arena. And then when we go back and we look at Project Blue Book and we see what was done there and how they manipulated the data to come up with the conclusion they wanted, a lot of the documentation in the Blue Book files was written with a mindset that suggested they didn't think the civilians were ever going to see this stuff. And so they freely communicated amongst themselves about that. And so you can see in the documentation available what they were attempting to do. There's many examples of that sort of thing. The Zamora sighting in 1957, Lonnie Zamora, the police officer who saw a landed object in Socorro, New Mexico, you can see in the reports that were written at that time, they didn't expect anybody outside the military or the Air Force to see these reports. And now that we see them, we've learned some things about the sighting that we didn't know until recently. And one of the best examples of that is that Zamora, prior to Zamora seeing the object and talking to the police dispatchers about it, 3 people had called into the police station to report seeing this thing in the sky and hearing the roar, seeing the blue flame. The police dispatcher didn't record it. And so you're thinking, well, here's just another great rumor. Well, a report was written the very night of the Zamora sighting by a guy named Richard Holder. He was an Army captain, interviewed Zamora within hours, literally 90 minutes of the sighting and that sort of thing, talked to the police dispatchers. And in his report, he talks about how the 3 people had called into the sheriff's or the police department reporting what they had seen. So we have documentation. We don't have the names of the witnesses. We don't know who they were. Nobody bothered to try to find them. This is the thing that I just do not understand. Socorro, it was a small town. You know where the witnesses were if you had their names. You could go to those neighborhoods. Even if you didn't have their names, you could go to the neighborhoods because you knew the flight path of the object and knock on doors until you found them. It wouldn't have been difficult to do, and nobody did it. So the Zamora sighting has always been written off, well, it was just single witness, this Lonnie Zamora guy who's a police officer. We don't think he made it up. And ironically, it's one of the few cases in the Project Blue Book files labeled unidentified where the source suggested he'd seen beings outside the craft, and it's labeled as unidentified. Usually, though, that sort of sighting is labeled as psychological, meaning the person has psychological problems because he's seeing alien creatures. But it's a wonderful sighting, but you can see how it was bungled. And it wasn't only bungled by the Air Force, it was bungled by the civilians as well. Carl and Jim Lorenzen, who ran APRO, which were very tenacious at following up on stuff, never thought to do that. And they think at the time, they may have moved to Tucson by that time, but in 1964, they may have still been in Alamogordo, which is like an hour down the road from Socorro, and Tucson isn't that far away either. And they were there within 2 days talking to people, but they never tried to find these other witnesses. And I don't know if it's because they didn't know about him, because Zamora and the police department and the military were being a little bit closed mouth about certain aspects of it, or what it was. Hynek never got to it, and Hynek was there. He wanted to go investigate a sighting in La Madera, which is, I think, up north of Santa Fe, New Mexico, of another landing the next night, and the Air Force wouldn't let him do it. The NICAP investigator didn't bother to go try to find the other witnesses. So you had a real bungling of the case. Part of it, I think, is through incompetence, and part of it is because the Air Force didn't want to expand the investigation. Hynek wanted to go a little bit deeper into it and was called home and that sort of thing. But the real point is, when you look at the documents from the Project Blue Book, the Project Blue Book files, you see that the way the reports were constructed, that the men writing the reports didn't expect those reports to be seen by us in the civilian world. And of course, 10 years later, everything's declassified and we're able to go through that material. But there's so much of it that a lot of little nuggets get lost.
Kevin, that's the kind of gems you find when you get to open the books up again and see the information that was off the cuff and candid back in the day. When you read those conversations as an investigator, you look at that as a pure version, a statement. That is what they were thinking at the time, and not restricted by having to worry about somebody else looking over their shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, we are talking to Kevin Randle. He is an investigator. He's a researcher and author. Please go to his website, kevinrandle.blogspot.com. Again, kevinrandle.blogspot.com, and check out a number of the books he has written. And today we're talking about Kevin's newest book, The Best of Project Blue Book. Came out in paperback March 5th and is available on Amazon in Kindle and in paperback. Kevin, we talked off air a bit about you having an opportunity to talk to Dr. Hynek's son, Paul Hynek, when you were doing the research for the Best of Project Blue Book.
I actually worked with Hynek at one point, too, on a couple of investigations. So,
oh, you did?
In the 1970s, so yes.
No, when you were like 7 years old back then? It's
I'm like 412 years old. So
I read that in the restroom. Yeah. I'm kidding.
I'm like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day when he's saying, he's saying, I've been around for so long. He's like God. I'm like a god. I've been around for so long. I know everybody, and that's kind of how I feel in the UFO field. I've been around for so long. I just know everything.
Yeah,
and been everywhere and talk to everybody.
And then, well, that's it, too. You've got the personality of, if you're in a crowd of people, you're not going to sit back. You just walk up and say, hi, I'm Kevin. I want to talk to you about this. What? It's the type of personality that gets the best information. When you worked with Dr. Hynek back in the 70s, what kind of work was he doing, and what were you doing back then?
Well, we just investigating UFO sightings. And when we went up to Minnesota, where there was a landing trace case, and we were working that, and I was knocking on doors, like I was complaining they didn't do it at Socorro, knocking on doors of people who were close to the area to see if they'd seen anything, because we were trying to find the craft, to see what the craft looked like that may have landed there. I think we finally concluded that what happened was this circular burn area had been a spot where they had piled up a lot of fertilizer or something, so that the chemicals had burned a circular area in the ground, because we couldn't find anybody who'd seen the craft that they thought had landed there. We couldn't find a witness to that. And so we did things like that. And we did a little bit with the cattle mutilations as well. I know that I talked to Dr. Hynek about cattle mutilations and what was going on with that whole thing in the 1970s. So we looked at all of that sort of thing. And then other things got in the way, like college educations and graduate school and the military and all of that stuff. But so I'd worked with him a little bit. I was doing on my blog analysis of Project Blue Book, the History Channel series. And I was a little disturbed about the way Hynek was being portrayed, a little bit overly aggressive and that sort of thing. And I was thinking to myself, well, I wonder what the family thinks about this. And then it suddenly dawned on me, well, I can find them. So I got an email address, and I sent an email to Paul Hynek. And we talked about how he felt about the way his father was portrayed in the series, and his mother with the Russian spy, and the other aspects of it just were completely and totally nonsensical. And according to him, they were delighted the way his father was portrayed. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, he's really this heroic kind of figure. Why wouldn't you be pleased with that? They weren't making him look like a dupe or anything. So we talked about that. I actually interviewed him on my radio program and talked about that and some of the things he had seen when he was a kid and how his father operated. Hynek was kind of a sloppy guy in one respect. And I remember that at one point, the Center for UFO Studies, which was the organization that Hynek started in the 1970s, their files were stacked on the steps up into his office as opposed to in file cabinets or things like that. So he was I guess kind of your typical professor. But he was very knowledgeable and worked very hard on the investigations. And it's interesting that he started out as the Project Sign scientific consultant, and it was rabidly anti-UFO, anti-flying saucer. And his attitude evolved over time as he talked to more of the witnesses and were involved in more of the cases. So by the time that the Blue Book ended, he thought there was a lot more to what was going on than the Air Force wanted him to think, or wanted everybody to think, I suppose. And that was why he started the Center for UFO Studies, because he thought there was something more to learn about what was happening. And he brought in a limited number of people. The Center for UFO Studies was never really a membership organization. It was just a small cadre of people that had some specific expertise or some specific knowledge or a specific interest, and a lot of them were academics or had been around the field for so long. I got involved with the Center for UFO Study in a roundabout way. I also write science fiction. And the other interesting thing I should point out before I go too far is science fiction. A lot of science fiction is written by scientists. So I'm a member of the Science Fiction Writers of America, and you get the annual telephone directory for them. And an awful lot of them are scientists working in actual scientific arenas. So a lot of scientists are involved in that. And they write the science fiction. So there was a science fiction convention held in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I was there with a number of other people, and we're going to have a debate on the reality of UFOs. It was Frederick Pohl. I think it may have been George R.R. Martin, but I'm not sure, because at the time George R.R. Martin actually lived in Dubuque, Iowa, and me arguing against the reality of UFOs, and a couple of guys coming up from the Center for UFO Studies to be the pro side. Well, when they showed up, it was Don Schmitt, and he was by himself. And I didn't think it was fair of us to be 3-1 in it's a debate, so I switched sides. I was now on the pro side because it was a debate. And I guess we kind of hit it off, because not long after that, he contacted me and wanted to know if I wanted to participate in their investigation of Roswell. And I knew a little bit about Roswell, but not much, and I didn't think much of the case at the time. And I said, sure, why not? And the reason they wanted me to come along is because they knew of my military background. And a lot of the witnesses, the people to be talking to, were either had been career military or retired military, or they were had military associations, obviously, because of the 518th Bomb Group. And so that was how I got involved with the Center for UFO Studies, and I was one of their investigators, and I became one of the contributing editors to the International UFO Reporter, contributing a lot of articles in the 1990s and into the 2000s about UFOs and aspects of the Roswell investigation and other investigations that caught my fancy.
And just so my listener knows, you've written another book called Roswell in the 21st Century. And again, that's available on Amazon, Roswell in the 21st Century. And you've been basically digging around Roswell for 30 years. I shouldn't say out there digging around it, but investigating the case of the UFO crash near Roswell, New Mexico. You've interviewed hundreds of people out there, and I want to touch on a little bit more about that later. But when you were working with the Center for UFO Studies, did you and the guys ever sit around and kind of wonder who the heck were piloting these vehicles? Whether they were coming from somewhere else or somewhere terrestrial?
Well, first, let me make a correction. I never worked for the Center for UFO Studies. They didn't pay for the investigations. Don and I were funding that out of our own pockets. So the Center for UFO Studies never had a lot of money to spread around. So we were doing it on our own nickel, so to speak. And Don and I would talk about other UFO sightings and other UFO cases, but we mostly concentrated on the Roswell case. And I know that we would get queries from other members of the Center for UFO Studies about cases and what we thought about them, and we'd talk a little bit about that. There wasn't a lot of speculation about who might be the pilots and that sort of thing that I was involved in, which is not to say they didn't do that in other arenas. But mainly we were talking about Roswell and what we were finding in our investigation. I was in Chicago, where the center was located, in 91, 92. And they were having a board meeting. Don and I were there. Don was a member of the board, but I was there as they wanted an update on what we'd found in Roswell. And they said to me, well, there's a telephone over there. Use it if you have some calls to make. And in 1991, before cell phones, and you could make free calls all over the damn world, making a long-distance call would cost you money. And I was spending $200 or $300 a month on long-distance phone calls, much to the chagrin of my wife, I might add. And so the opportunity to use a free telephone was welcomed. And I point all this out because one of the people I called was a fellow named Edwin Easley. He had been the provost marshal at the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell in 1947. The provost marshal being like the chief of police. He was the number one police officer on the base, and he commanded the MP company and the Special Services company. Both of them were security and law enforcement type things. And so during this conversation with him while I'm at the Center for UFO Studies, which I wasn't recording, I normally recorded the phone calls with the people I was talking to, but I didn't have a way to record it. And I asked him, I said, are we following the right path? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, we think it's extraterrestrial. And he said, let me put it this way, it's not the wrong path. He was always cagey about what he would tell us because I don't think he wanted to violate his oaths that he'd taken back in 1947. The point is, once he'd said that and I got off the phone, I went in and interrupted the board meeting and told him what I just learned from the provost marshal, which we all found very exciting. Well, then Mark Roediger, who was the scientific director of the center at the time, had an opportunity. He was going to go to Fort Worth, where Easley lived. And he wanted me to set up a meeting with Easley. And I think, great, get somebody else in to talk to him and get another perspective on what we're talking about here. And I wrote to the family and discovered he was terminally ill. And so Roediger never got the chance to do it. And I never got a chance to talk to him again to see if I could get him to say again that it was extraterrestrial, because I didn't record it. People said, well, I'd have gone out and bought a new recorder right then and there and called him right back. And I'm thinking, no, I had an opportunity. I planned to go visit the guy. I was going to go see him in person and talk to him about this. Who could predict that he was going to get he was going to come down with terminal cancer, for crying out loud, and we wouldn't be able to do it. And the last letter I sent to him frightened his wife. She thought I was some kind of a government investigator trying to get something on her husband so I could take away the pension. And one of the daughters wrote me a very nice letter about this, and I wrote back to the daughter. I said, please take, I'm very sorry about this. Please assure your mother I have nothing to do with anything like that, and I will not bother you folks again. I mean, the guy's terminally ill. What more can I do? But I mean, that's just sort of the thing that transpired. And so when we were looking at the Roswell case, it was something that we were doing on our own. We would go in and talk to them about Roswell or other aspects of it, and it led at one point to a big controversy about the crash over on the plains of San Augustine and a witness named Gerald Anderson. And that all culminated in a big conference held in Chicago, sponsored by the Fund for UFO Research and the Center for UFO Studies. And there was a publication that was written about it. George Eberhardt edited it, where we all presented our papers, Don and I and Tom Carey on one side, Don Berliner and Stan Friedman on the other side, about whether or not to believe the Anderson case, and then Mike Swords as sort of the moderator talking about it from his point of view. So we did sit around and talk about that case in that way frequently. because we were focused on that, and rarely would other cases come up. And we would say things, well, that Socorro case is kind of interesting. What do you think about that? And talk a little bit about that. And it wasn't until I started doing my radio show that I got really interested in that case because of a comment made during one of my the interviews I conducted. So while others may have sat around and done that, we didn't really do that. And then thinking about it, down in Roswell, you go to the big festival down in Roswell, and I often am sitting around with the other investigators and the other people who are involved, but we really don't talk about UFOs. The last time I was in Roswell, which was last summer, I did 4 interviews for my radio show, and then so in that context, we were talking about other things. Although I talked to Don Schmidt, and we were basically talking about Roswell being in Roswell, but I talked to Kathleen Marden about the Barney and Betty Hill case, for example, and that sort of thing. So it just really wasn't the topic. The overall topic you would expect us to talk about when we got together, because we were usually focused on Roswell and that sort of thing, I guess.
Kevin, it is generally said that along with Stanton Friedman, you two were generally acknowledged as like the leading researchers into the Roswell story and UFO question that came of it. In your work and your years of digging into that story itself, is there that aha moment or the obvious slap in the forehead saying, yeah, that obviously shows it's a cover-up? Was there something that you stumbled upon and just said, yeah, this is a gimme. This is a government cover-up of something, and whatever it was, people were silenced?
Well, clearly it was a cover-up, because something fell, and the military lied about it. And of course, they admitted they lied about it. So, yeah, it was a cover-up. We can prove that. That's no question. Everybody agrees something fell. Everybody agrees there was an original cover-up. The question is, what fell? And that's where we get off into the various tangents, looking at the case. But Don and I went into this, and we both were familiar with the idea of the crash at Roswell, but we also believed that we would find an explanation, a terrestrial explanation for it rather rapidly. We didn't expect it to take the direction it did, because we'd looked at other cases of UFO crashes. Actually, I've done 2 books now, one called A History of UFO Crashes, and the other one was Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky. Both of them looked in depth at some UFO crashes. Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky, I think there's like 110 different crashes listed in the book. The vast majority of them have terrestrial explanations. There's 4 or 5 that are kind of really mysterious. Roswell being one of them, of course, Shag Harbor being another one that really is mysterious. So we expected we would find an explanation for this, because at the time we were still in the mode where we all believed, and I say we all in the UFO community believed, that the idea of UFO crashes was based on hoaxes and nonsensical reports. And it was about the time that Len Stringfield was beginning his research into crash retrievals, but all his documentation and his research hadn't come out yet, so we were still a little bit confused by all of that. But we didn't really expect to find anything unusual. When we got to Roswell, we had set up an interview with Frank Joyce. And Frank Joyce was a radio announcer at KGFL Radio in July of 1947, and talked to Mac Brazel, the guy who found the debris. And we had an interview set up with him in Albuquerque. And we get to Albuquerque, and he begs off. He can't do it. He doesn't feel well. Well, I thought, well, there's a surprise. We had a meeting with a group, UFO group in Albuquerque. We went to the meeting, and they turned out to be a whole bunch of New Agers, which wasn't real helpful in investigating the UFO case. We got down to Roswell. We were supposed to meet with Cliff Stone, but he didn't want to meet us at his house. He was going to meet us at the Burger King on the north side of town. He shows up in his Army uniform, which I thought was kind of bizarre. And I don't know why he didn't want to meet us at his house, because he was listed in the telephone directory. So if I wanted to find his house, I could have. But we eventually ended up at his house, and he goes off, and he's parading up and down his living room, lecturing us on UFOs. And I realized immediately he didn't have a real good grasp of logical thinking. He was telling us about a report out of Chile about a UFO encounter with a military aircraft, and it said in the report, and he handed us the document so we could read it ourselves, said the Chilean Air Force fighter had fired on the UFO without results. And Stone was saying, well, they fired at it and they hit it and it didn't do anything. And I'm thinking, no, it doesn't say that. It says it fired without results, means they might have missed. Let's not draw any conclusions not there. And he was telling us all about what he knew, and it was not helpful. And that evening, after we'd met with Stone, the next day we were going to meet with Bill Brazel, the son of the man that found it. And I'm saying to Don, and Don's saying to me, there's really nothing here. We've gotten nowhere. This is nonsense. We get over and we're talking to Bill Brazel, and he turned the whole thing around. We're listening to this guy, and he says, yes, I handled the debris. This is what my father saw. Here's what the Air Force did. Here's the guy telling us exactly what had happened. And a credible source, down-to-earth, cowboy-type guy. He's not going to be lying to us about this. He was reluctant to meet with us at all. And he told us later that he had told his wife that if he liked us, he'd help us out, but if he didn't like us, he'd kind of blow us off. So we were able to convince him that we were good guys. And as we were going back to Albuquerque after that meeting, I said to Don, there is more. We've got to come back. And he said, yeah, we've got to. The next trip down, we met with Bill Brazel again. And the reason I go into this one, because it's kind of funny. So we're going to meet him at 8 o'clock in the morning at this diner. And we'd buy him breakfast. He said, no, Shirley cooks the best breakfast. I don't need anybody else. So we're in his pickup truck at 8 o'clock in the morning. We're driving cross country to the debris field. He's going to show us where it is. So when people say, I don't know where the debris field is, Bill Brazel took me. He stood right there and said, this is where I found stuff. So I know where the debris field is. So we're driving cross country, and he says, you boys want a beer? And I'm thinking, yeah, 8 o'clock in the morning, that's what I want's a beer. And Don is a teetotaler. He said, well, no, I don't drink. And I'm thinking, well, the guy's being nice enough to drive us cross country. He's helping us out. Somebody ought to be sociable and drink a beer with him. So I'm sucking down a warm beer at 8 o'clock in the morning as we're driving cross country. But we get to the debris field. He parks his car. We get out, and he says, yeah, it's right about here I found some of these little scraps of the material. And he says, down there was a gouge through the patch. It took about 2 years to grass back over. So I know where the debris field is. Bill Brazel showed me where it was. But I mean, talking to him again gave us more information. One of the guys said to us in Roswell, we were talking to, he says, you want to talk to the family of the sheriff? Well, yeah. And one of the daughters, Phyllis McGuire, she had happened to have been in the sheriff's office when when Jesse Marcel showed up, the air intelligence officer from Roswell, and Mac Brazel showed up, and they were talking about this, and eventually chased her out of the office. So we could get a perspective from her what was going on in the sheriff's office at the time from somebody who was actually in the office. And from that point on, we were able to find other people. We found Walter Hott, which wasn't hard to do. We looked him up in the phone book and went and chatted with him. Stan had a little bit harder time finding Walter Hott, but when he found him, but we talked to any number of people who were there and were able to give us their perspective of exactly what they had seen and done. And the other sad thing is, as we got more in depth, we found people coming out of the woodworks to talk to us, and way too many of them were making up their stories. And I don't know what the motivation was for some of them to do that. I know once the media got involved and there were documentaries being filmed in Roswell that a lot of people saw it as their chance to get their 15 minutes in the spotlight.
Yeah.
But we tried to eliminate those people. We tried to vet the witnesses as best we could. And I think Don was the same way. In the beginning, we were a little bit more willing to accept what people told us as the truth, figuring they wouldn't be making this up, until I read a book called Stolen Valor. And it's about all these people who claim to have been in Vietnam. And they weren't. And you read the stories about what they said and what they were doing, and then you go to the files, their DD Form 214, and you find out that they didn't serve in Vietnam, or they had no DD Form 214 because they didn't serve in the military. And just literally hundreds of thousands of people claiming Vietnam service they didn't have. So from that point on, I became a little bit more cautious. So if somebody told me about his military service, I would check it out. And I think Carl Flock, who did the book Roswell, Inconvenient Facts and the Will to Believe, and he was calling us out for a guy named His last name was Lovejoy. I want to say Frank Lovejoy, but it wasn't. He had a Hispanic surname, and we had mentioned him in a footnote about corroborating some of the evidence about the crash, and Carl Flock called us out about that and that we didn't know who he was. And there's a series of books that would tell you all the officers who were serving on active duty. And so I went and looked him up and found a reference that he was a lieutenant colonel, just as he said, and so that kind of helped vet his tale. He didn't really tell us much, and before we had an opportunity to talk to him at length, he passed away. But we were able to vet him that way. So we became much more cautious in accepting stories, and we were able to, I guess, prove any number of witnesses hadn't been in Roswell at the time they claimed, or they hadn't done what they claimed about the Roswell case. And so when I did the book, Roswell in the 21st Century, I eliminated an awful lot of that stuff that we know wasn't true. But some of them you had to deal with to make it clear that these stories were no longer acceptable as evidence of the Roswell crash. But when you get to the end of the book, what you realize is there is no terrestrial explanation. Does that mean it's extraterrestrial? Absolutely not. It means we have no explanation. It is the very definition of unidentified. Now, for some people, that would be sufficient evidence to prove it's extraterrestrial. I would like something a little stronger, a little bit more than the process of elimination to get to that point. But the point is, I have no explanation for what fell at Roswell, and that can lead you into the extraterrestrial. And so the Roswell in the 21st Century kind of boils down everything that we all had learned over the 25 years or the 30 years of investigations into the Roswell case, the witnesses that we had talked to, the documentation we had found, the dead ends we followed, some of the witnesses who turned out to be less than credible. I would say lying sacks of, but we can't do that. But, boil it down and give the best evidence that we have, including we found a timeline printed in a newspaper about the story as it came out of Roswell and how the story developed from the announcement by Walter Haut that they'd captured a flying saucer to the point where General Ramey says, no, it's a weather balloon. And it took place over about 3 hours on July 8th, 1947. I could say a Tuesday afternoon, if you will, in 1947. About that, and how now it became, for the longest time, if you mentioned the Roswell case, people say, I was solved as a balloon. And then once we got into it and began to expand it out from that, more and more people learned about what exactly the Roswell case was, and we've moved into that arena. And as I say, Roswell in the 21st century, I think there's like 1,000 footnotes in the book. So you know where all the information came from. It's all been vetted carefully. It's the best information we have today. It eliminates some of it. One of the things we investigated, which is just absolutely hilarious, is Frank Joyce. We finally did get to see Frank Joyce on our second trip. Frank Joyce was well, and he says, yeah, come on over, boys. And we had a nice chat with him. But he said that Mac Brazel had told him about the crash on a Sunday night when they got into Roswell. And then Wednesday, after Brazel had been brought back to Roswell and he was in the custody of the military, he was brought into the radio station to talk to Joyce again, and he gave him a little bit different story. And as Brazel was leaving, he said to Joyce, well, you know how they talk about little green men? Well, they weren't green. And so that set us off on a chasing down, when did the term little green man enter the lexicon? And I think we chased it back to a 1908 story that dealt with the Green Man. And then there was a Popeye cartoon in the 1930s, late 1938, 39, where he was fighting green Martians. There was, and then there was a 1946 science fiction story. I think it was 1946 science fiction story called The Little Green Man, who was an alien who was trying to buy equipment on the market to repair his crashed spacecraft. And so what we learned is there is a possibility that Brazel would have associated the color green with alien creatures from another world. So it wasn't completely outside the realm of possibility that he had made that comment to Frank Joyce. But I mean, that gives you the level of the research that we went to was to trace down the lexicon of little green man. And we did that with a couple of other things as well. When did that enter the lexicon? And would they have been using that term in 1947? Interstellar flight? No, they wouldn't have been using it. Extraterrestrial? No. Alien? No. But they would have been talking about Martians. They would have been talking about that sort of thing. And there's all kinds of science fiction that predates the crash in 1947 that would have led you to talking about that. And when they talked about it in public arenas, newspaper articles, magazine articles speculating on life on other planets, they always limited it to inside the solar system, the Martians and the Venusians. And we, of course, know there are no Martians or Venusians at this point, but in 1947 they didn't. And they were coming up with ideas. They wanted to create in the Mojave, in the Sahara Desert, a huge representation of the Pythagorean theorem, fill it with oil, and set it on fire at night, so that the Martians, if they were watching, might be able to see it and realize that there was intelligent life on Earth. And I'm not sure there is intelligent life on Earth, but that's just me. But I mean, so they were thinking of ways of communicating with the Martians. So in that time frame, it makes sense talking about Martians. But it's not like it was something that was completely unheard of and completely unusual. So we did all of that sort of research as well. We went to the ice house, the local ice house, because the idea was that the bodies had been packed in dry ice. And to see if they had logbooks about that. And what we discovered was that they had logbooks from 1927 to 1928, and then there was a big gap. And they'd only found those logbooks because they had fallen behind a cabinet or something. So we weren't able to trace that story down. But we did attempt to do that.
You know, Kevin, I'm really impressed with the attention to detail that was put into the research and your investigation through the documentation that you had access to dig into the backgrounds of each of the answers to questions maybe people had 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or at the time back in 1947. You actually tracked info back. And during an investigation, during a interview or interrogation, some people may call them, depending on how exciting the interview is going. But when you get that pure version statement, that conversation and having somebody then reviewing the statement and literally taking yellow highlighter to things saying, we're going to have to go back over this and we can prove this and let's do some background on that. You guys did it. You guys went, I'm going to say over and above when you're talking about the lexicon of little green men and going back to see the logbooks and whatever there may have been at a dry ice plant. These are things that we would do now in a homicide investigation, a counterterrorism investigation. You were doing it on witness statements from 60 years ago in a possible UFO sighting. It's amazing that you actually do that, and kudos to you and your team and whoever else you were with doing this to figure that out, that those kind of details are really important when it comes time to prove your theory or show proof. And hopefully it's not a theory. It's by that time you're going to stand up saying, this is what I can say, and I'm going to stand behind it. So very, very impressed at that.
Well, in some respects, we have to thank Philip Klass for that, because one of the things that Don Schmidt and I would do is sit around and say, well, what would Phil Klass say? What would be his arguments against this? Phil Klass was our devil's advocate, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
And we would say, well, he's going to say Little Green Man didn't exist in the lexicon at the time, so let's find out when it entered the lexicon. And so we were able to learn those sorts of things. And like I said, in Roswell in the 21st century, there's a footnote, and it's a long footnote that deals with all this information about little green men. And there's a number of footnotes like that takes you through that. It doesn't break up the flow of the text, but the information is there if you want to chase it down and see what we had to say about those specific aspects of it.
Kevin, have you ever seen a UFO?
I I used to answer the question no, because my UFO sighting was so crappy. I just didn't really talk about it. But when I was a teenager, a friend of mine, Eric Novotny, and I belonged to the Denver UFO Society, which I understand is still in existence and is one of the longest running UFO organizations in the history of the world. And we went out to a get-together on a ranch just south of Denver near Castle Rock. And we're sitting around the campfire that night, and we watched a light cross the sky from north to south, got right overhead and flashed one time, and then continued on. Didn't stop, it just flashed and continued its course. And somebody with us said, oh, look, they're signaling us. And Eric and I are thinking, yeah, sure they are. But we checked, and there was nothing in a polar orbit at that time that would have been in that location. So we don't know what we saw, but I mean, it was just a light crossing the sky. And there was really no detail. It took 4 or 5 minutes. There was probably 25, 30 people that saw it. So, I mean, it's just nothing spectacular. It's what Alan Hynek would have suggested was a nocturnal light. And it wasn't even a good nocturnal light for that matter.
I went out and did one of those UFO tours in Sedona, Arizona, where you get the night vision goggles and you go out and stand in the desert, and you get the identity where, okay, this is a military jet, it's got the strobe on it, this is a commercial jet, and this is what a satellite looks like. And these things look like satellites, but they travel in groups. And you hit them 3 times with a handheld laser. They're estimated around 13 miles up. And they get about 10 times brighter, and then they dim back down again when you do that, or they'll stop and they'll go in 90-degree angles, and they're shooting all over the place. I can tell you they're unidentified, they're flying in their objects. That's all I can tell you.
Well, I know that in today's environment, we prefer the term unidentified aerial phenomenon, because if you say unidentified flying object, you're implying that it's actually flying. And if you say object, you're implying that it has a physical presence.
Yeah.
So if you say unidentified aerial phenomenon, you're implying absolutely nothing other than there was something in the sky and you don't know what it was. And like with UFO, it could be basically anything.
Yeah, well, that's the argument. People say, well, yeah, those could be some other military group. When they're actually reacting, or you have the perception of them reacting to a handheld laser, which is literally that little pointer you use in class to point on the whiteboard, it's fascinating. And I think out of the 1,100 and some tours that Melinda Leslie, this lady, puts on, I think she had 1 day out of that they didn't see anything. And there were about 35 or 36 days where they actually saw the big V flying things with the lights inserted in the bottom. Didn't get lucky and see one of those, but all these little ones, and it baffles me. I don't know what they are and what they could be, but they weren't close to the ground, and they were definitely up there reacting and flying, and not flying like satellites don't get launched and fly in groups. And because they just can't. You can't launch, and it's not good for your satellite to be flying beside another one. I don't know what they were, but they definitely were very, very interesting and very intriguing.
And that's kind of the my sighting. It wasn't a group of them. It was just one light moving across the sky, and I don't really know what it was. I would say it was a satellite, but like I said, Eric and I chased it down, and we couldn't find any evidence. And I periodically afterwards I looked, thinking that, well, maybe it was a classified satellite at the time, and they didn't want people to know it was up there. And when I was an Air Force intelligence officer, we used to get the information about satellites when they would be overhead and that sort of thing. So, but we tried to chase it down, and I was never able to find anything that would suggest it was a satellite. So it's just a bright light across the sky, and who knows what it was. It may have been an airplane that kind of fooled us, but we didn't see any navigation lights. There was no engine noise, but if the wind was blowing in the wrong direction, we probably wouldn't have heard it anyway. And it was just a single light, and it was a steady light until it got directly overhead and flashed the one time. And so that suggests it wasn't an airplane, but I have no idea what it was. It was unidentified aerial phenomenon.
It was a UAP.
Yes.
Hey, as a Colorado boy, did you have any interest, or at the time were you aware of the University of Colorado UFO project?
Oh, absolutely.
The Condon Committee.
Absolutely. And Eric and I talked about that, but we never thought to go visit them. And I don't know why we didn't, but we were well aware of it, and we thought it was going to be a good thing. But boy, and I hesitate to say this, I graduated from high school in 1967, which means I'm really, really old. And within 3 or 4 weeks of graduating from high school, I was in the Army. And that would have been, July of 1967. And then I went to flight school. I got out of flight school in August of 1968. In September of 1968, I was in Vietnam. By the time I got back from Vietnam, the investigation was over. I've been back just a couple of months, and I was standing in my living room with a couple of other fellow officers, and we heard the announcement that Project Blue Book was being closed. So I never really had an opportunity to go to the University of Colorado and do anything with that. The one thing I did not know, I went to the University of Iowa after I got out of the Army. What I did not know is if your home of record had been Colorado, meaning I joined the Army from Colorado, I could have gone into any of the state schools tuition free. I found that out after I graduated from the University of Iowa, which is kind of annoying. But no, I have been accused of working with Hector Quintanilla at Project Blue Book, and I'm thinking, when? I was in high school until 1967, and then I was in the Army until 1971, and so there was no time for me to work with him on Project Blue Book. But, so we were aware of it, and I know Eric and I talked about it, and we thought it would be a good thing. We didn't realize that it was a setup. So there you go.
Yeah, the Condon Committee was, just a farce, really. And not only knowing that from watching one of the last episodes of Project Blue Book on TV, but where they actually had a little snippet of that. But I'm sure I still have a copy of the 1969 Condon Committee published report, a scientific study of unidentified flying objects that was put out. You know, how many other report or government committee actually had a paperback made out of them? But it was made for mass market. They wanted to get that word out there that no, we don't want to look into this kind of stuff. It's a waste of the government's time. It's a waste of money, and there's nothing to be learned by the study of these UFOs. And yeah, it's unfortunate. And those scientists, the real scientists, and Dr. Hynek, one of them, they said at the time that these people judging them or coming out and saying that there's no real scientific evidence, of no background in looking at ufology or even looking at some of the reports that had come through. It was their personal belief based on the physics of the time that, okay, this stuff couldn't happen. Even the ones that were kind of the blatant, I saw this flying at this speed, and they just kind of shrugged it off. Well, I think one of them actually said, how did something fly at supersonic speed without making a sonic boom? And it was, you just don't understand if you have a civilization that could somehow travel at supersonic speeds, it may actually have a technology that they could do that without producing a sonic boom in Earth's atmosphere. But they're basing it on their experience, their understanding of physics, and maybe even their own belief systems, whether that's religious or their gut as scientists. Yeah, it was. To me, it was a sham, that whole Condon Committee. And if anybody wants to look into it, there's you can just Condon, CONDON Committee, Google it, and you'll read numerous articles on the pros and cons of what had happened back in the Condon report that came out back in 1969. Kevin, as a researcher, and as we kind of covered off, kind of a fellow attention to detail, when you're kind of out to do an interview with somebody, what was one of the investigative techniques that you really started to fall back on? Where were you finding you were getting your best information and and you and I know when we're talking to people, a lot of times you go by a gut feeling. You kind of look them in the eye and see almost what they're feeling as they're retelling a story.
Well, one of the things we did is people would say to me, have you interviewed Sheridan Cavett? He was the guy that went out with Mac Brazel and Jesse Marcel to the debris field in 1947. And at the time I would say no. And they said, why not? I said, because I want to sit in the room with him. When I talk to him, I want to watch his body language. I want to watch his facial expressions. I want to see how he reacts. And the only time he really gave us a clue is Don was talking to Cavett's wife, Mary. I was talking to Cavett, and I said something about the bodies. He got very nervous. He leaned forward. He picked up a magazine. He leaned back. He tossed the magazine to the coffee table, and he said, Bill Rickett tell you that? And trying to protect Bill Rickett, I said, no, I got it from Edwin Easley. And he relaxed immediately, and I thought, well, I blew that. But the point simply is I had an opportunity to observe his reactions and observe his body language and observe how he was talking to us and how he related to us. And a lot of times that's important to a conversation. In today's environment, we could do it via Skype and get sort of the same thing. And you can pick up some of that on the telephone and whatnot. But Cavett was the one guy I wanted to see in person. I wanted to talk to him in person. I think Don and I visited with him twice. One Sierra Vista, Arizona, which is right outside the gates of Fort Huachuca, and that's where the Army's intelligence schools are. And once up in Sequim, Washington, where he and his wife lived. They had been wintering in Sierra Vista. They rented an apartment for the winter down in Sierra Vista, so we had an opportunity to shoot over from Roswell to Sierra Vista to talk to him. Interestingly enough, and off on a tangent, when we were involved with the Showtime original movie Roswell, and the film company for a period of time was headquartered in Sierra Vista. So I was back in Sierra Vista to do the movie.
Well, Kevin, that's just karma bringing you back to Sierra Vista. I wonder if there was somebody there you needed to interview again. Well, I want to thank you for dropping by. This has been very, very interesting. And again, we have been with Kevin Randle. Please go to his website, kevinrandleblogspot.com, or just Google kevinrandle.com and it'll take you there.
It's kevinrandle.blogspot.com.
Yes, you got to throw the dots in. Also, go to Amazon or just Google Amazon and Kevin D. Randle or Kevin Randle, and you'll take you to his book, The Best of Project Blue Book. Please check it out. And if you do get it, please throw a review in on the book. Again, it's on Kindle right now for those who like their tablets and reading on Kindle. Also look at the other books that he has, and we were just talking about one of them about his work at Roswell. Very, very good investigator. I really appreciate you coming out and sharing your information with us.
Delighted to do it. Delighted to do it.
Watching you while you sleep all alone.
All right, that's it. Let's roll. And hey. Let's be careful out there.
Far over the snow, what are those voices? They sing as they go. What are those voices? Look up for the mountains. Because somebody hide, somebody better hide. And through the hail, like a pack of angry wolves on the trail. We are after you, dead or alive. We are out to get you, dead or alive. And forget your toes. If you're the one, better run away. Son, you are done. Throw your gun away. Here come the Mounties to get the man they're after now. Run through the hail, like a pack of angry wolves on the trail. Dead or alive, we are out to get you, dead or alive. If you're the one, better run away. Son, you are done. Throw your gun away. Here come the Mounties to get the man they're after. No!